After 24 years of often brutal Indonesian occupation, and after the Indonesian Army-sponsored militia violence and destruction in September 1999, East Timor, on the 20th of May 2002, finally achieved their independence. Unfortunately, more than 70% of East Timor's infrastructure was damaged or destroyed during the September 1999 violence. The country was systematically reduced to ash and rubble. East Timor is now trying to rebuild itself. But East Timor is a poor country, in fact the poorest country in Asia. More than 40% of the population lives on less than $1 a day. However, East Timor has significant deposits of offshore oil and gas reserve, and it recently concluded a treaty with Australia to share those resources. The Australian Prime Minister John Howard claimed Australia had been generous by giving East Timor 90% of the share. But Dr. Andrew McNaughton disagrees.
East Timor will get 90% of the royalties for the JPDA, but East Timor is in fact entitled to much wider maritime boundaries, and overall Timor is certainly not getting 90% of its entitlements.
Dr. McNaughton is the convener of the Australian East Timor Association and has been an advocate and long-time campaigner for East Timor.
The 90% that East Timor is receiving refers to the revenues from the Joint Petroleum Development Area, or JPDA. The JPDA is an area within East Timor's maritime entitlements, but in fact its overall maritime entitlements are much bigger than the JPDA.
The treaty sets up a Joint Petroleum Development Area, the JPDA, which is much smaller in area than East Timor's entitled seabed boundary. This JPDA is, in fact, Zone A of the now-defunct 1989 Timor Gap Treaty between Australia and Indonesia. Petroleum resources within the JPDA are shared 90-10 in favour of East Timor. However, the bulk of the resources lie just outside the boundary of the JPDA. And although these resources belong to East Timor, Australia is claiming them as wholly Australian.
There are three significant oil and gas resources within this area. The first is called Bayuundan. It's a gas and condensate field, and it lies within the Joint Petroleum Development Area. It will therefore pay 90% of its revenue to East Timor. The second and most significant resource is the Greater Sunrise gas field, which lies across the eastern border of the JPDA. It has about 3 times as large gas reserves as Bayuundan. Under the existing Timor Sea Treaty, 20% of this field is deemed to lie within the Joint Petroleum Development Area. However, 80% is deemed to lie outside the Joint Petroleum Development Area, and therefore will pay no revenue to East Timor at all. The third major resource is the Laminaria Corallina oil field. This is only a number of kilometres outside the western border of the Joint Petroleum Development Area. Therefore, this field will pay no revenues at all to East Timor. But the point is that under international law, all of these reserves are East Timorese.
The Timor Sea Treaty is a petroleum resource sharing treaty between Australia and East Timor. It is not a maritime boundary treaty between the two countries. According to a legal opinion by Professor Vaughan Lowe, an expert in international law and maritime boundaries from Oxford University, and Commander Christopher Carlton from the UK Hydrographic Office, East Timor's lateral boundary would extend beyond that of the JPDA. Kate Eastman, a barrister and lecturer in international law and specialising in human rights issues, also agrees with this aspect of the Lowe-Carlton opinion.
Certainly, I do agree with the opinions, and I do agree that the boundaries would extend.
The median line between Australia and East Timor is the same as the southern boundary of the JPDA, so that boundary wouldn't change. On the western boundary, the border would be significantly further west than the JPDA and would encompass the Laminaria-Corallina field. To the east, the eastern border would involve at least 80% of the Greater Sunrise gas field. In fact, the eastern boundary may encompass 100% of the Greater Sunrise gas field, which would mean that the resources within East Timor's maritime boundaries are much greater than those within the JPDA of the Timor Sea Treaty. Until now, although Timor has the right to a seabed boundary with Australia, there has been no agreement, and there is currently no seabed boundary between Australia and East Timor.
Under international law, East Timor is entitled to claim its own maritime boundaries. The first starting point is that East Timor and Australia would negotiate the boundaries. If that was unsuccessful, they could then use the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea or the International Court of Justice to adjudicate any dispute about the maritime boundary.
However, to preempt East Timor taking the matter to international arbitration, Australia in March 2002 withdrew from that part of the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice which deals with maritime boundary.
It means that East Timor will have to negotiate directly with Australia, so clearly East Timor as a newly independent state will be locked into a David and Goliath battle with Australia to resolve fair and equitable maritime boundaries.
In energy terms, Bayu Undan, Greater Sunrise and Laminaria-Corallina have a total reserve of more than 3 billion barrels of oil equivalent.
Well, in the Timor Sea, within East Timor's potential maritime boundaries, we're talking about oil and gas reserves equivalent to 3.3 billion barrels of oil. Now, under the current arrangements with the Timor Sea Treaty, East Timor would have access to or jurisdiction over 1.3 billion barrels of oil equivalent in energy terms, which is 40% of the total.
East Timor will also miss out on the industrial spin-offs, worth millions of dollars and thousands of jobs, because the gas from Bayu Undan, under the current arrangement, will be piped to Darwin instead of East Timor. Claire Martin, the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory, also wants the gas from Greater Sunrise to be piped to Darwin.
The gas can be piped to East Timor. It's technically feasible for a pipeline to be laid from Bayu Undan to the south coast of East Timor. And furthermore, a recent study by a major international offshore technology company has quantified the cost and has found that a pipeline going north to Timor is approximately 2/3 the capital cost of a pipeline going south to Darwin.
The oil and gas revenue is worth billions of dollars to East Timor.
My figure is, for all of those oil and gas reserves, we're talking about $66 billion in present day value. And that's easily verified by multiplying the 3.3 billion barrels of oil equivalent by a reasonable price for crude oil in the region of $20 a barrel. I calculate of that present day value of 66 billion, the government take, the all-up government take would be very close to $30 billion in present day value.
East Timor's share of this $30 billion is less than 40%. Even a modest 5% increase in the revenue East Timor gets would amount to hundreds of millions of dollars, more than Australia's entire contribution to the East Timor campaign since September 1999. Think of what East Timor could do with that money. How many schools, classrooms, hospitals, health clinics, roads and other infrastructure that money could provide. How many jobs those additional services would also provide. The East Timorese people know that their future lies in educating their children. Their children are aware of this. But East Timor is a poor country and cannot afford to provide the basic educational facilities in the classroom that we in Australia take for granted. East Timor also has major health problems, particularly tuberculosis.
We've come here to the village of Fatolai today just to do a general medical clinic and to do a mobile clinic for the TB program. And we've got one lady positive here that's going to start treatment, and we have 3 or 4 children that will probably need to start treatment as well.
East Timor also has a high infant mortality rate.
That we are in a new struggle to eliminate the disease, to eradicate illiteracy, to eradicate poverty, and if we have the resources from the Timor Sea, we can be more capable to start building the basis in all these sectors.
The East Timorese people know they must ultimately rely on themselves. They also know they must not depend solely on the oil and gas revenue.
If we rely totally on the resources from oil and gas, maybe in the future we will face terrible social, economic problems.
They know they must develop sustainable job-creating industries like fishing, ecotourism and reforestation. But these industries require massive injection of capital. And East Timor can only afford it if they get their rightful share of the oil and gas resources. By agreeing to give East Timor their rightful share, Australia would also benefit, because more likely than not, it would be Australian technology and know-how that would help East Timor set up those industries. As Australians, we were proud of our involvement in East Timor. And when we opened our hearts and our wallets to help the suffering East Timorese people, we did not expect payment in return.
Regarding East Timor, we went over there, our troops went over there with large hearts, representing the large hearts of the Australian population to help our brothers and sisters in need at long last. And now, regarding the oil in the East Timor Gap, it's as though we're putting our hand out and saying, OK, you owe us, whereas the truth is that we owe them.
The fact is, the resources being talked about here are East Timor's resources. We're talking about the area north of the median line, which is in East Timor's territory. South of the median line is 100% Australian, and East Timor has absolutely no claim on that. The area we're talking about is north of the median line, it's East Timor's, and in fact what's happening there is that Australia is taking 60% of East Timor's resources.
We have a duty to do what is just and fair. Australians have always prided themselves on their fairness. Now, if we try to start stealing what is rightfully the Timorese people's oil in the Timor Gap, well, that is certainly not fair. They don't expect, I'm sure, that after our befriending them in 1999, that we'd now turn around and take what is rightfully theirs.
By refusing to negotiate a meaningful and equitable maritime boundary with East Timor, and by claiming more than 60% of its resources as Australian, Australia is in fact forcing East Timor, the poorest country in the region, to pay for the cost of Australia's involvement there, not once, but many times over. Is that our idea of a fair go?
I don't think the current deal is a fair go at all, but it would be very easy for Australia to give East Timor a fairer share of Greater Sunrise, and that could be done with the stroke of a pen. If Australia was to give Timor, for example, 50% of the revenues of Greater Sunrise, it would be a much more equitable outcome than the current arrangement.
We don't ask less or more, that we know we must do or we should do. We would like to see and believe is that Australia can adopt an understanding attitude towards our claims.
The world, including Australia, stood by in unified silence for 24 years until the horrific events of September 1999 forced Australians to wake up and intervene. As Australians, we were united and proud of our involvement in East Timor, and the world community gave us a pat on the back for it. Let us not now spoil this by trying to rob the East Timorese of their future. Let's give the East Timorese people a fair go by restoring the fair share of their entitlements.